You step outside just after sunrise, the air still carrying that faint coolness of early morning, the yard quiet except for the soft shifting of leaves and the distant sound of a passing car 2 streets away. And there, near the edge of the feeder, a cardinal is already present, not hopping, not calling, just standing in a way that feels almost too still for something alive, its red body catching fragments of light as the sun slowly rises above the rooftops. And at first you think nothing of it because this is what mornings are supposed to look like, familiar, repeated, ordinary. But then you notice something subtle, something your mind almost dismisses before it fully forms. The bird is not scanning the ground, not searching for movement in the trees. It is looking at you, or at least in your direction, in a way that feels held, extended, intentional. And the longer you stand there without moving, the more the space between you and that small figure begins to feel different, as if the yard itself has shifted its attention. And if you are new here, you might consider subscribing before you go further, because what you are about to see changes the way you interpret quiet moments like this, moments you thought you understood, and then the cardinal finally moves, just slightly, a tilt of the head, a pause that lasts half a second longer than expected, and it is in that small delay that something unsettlingly subtle begins to form. Not fear, not certainty, but awareness, as if you have been noticed in a way you did not notice before. And that is where it should end. But it doesn't, because what happens next is not about the bird leaving, it is about the way it continues to linger in your perception even after it is gone. And yet, as you stand there a little longer, something about that stillness begins to feel strangely familiar. Not in a dramatic way, but in the quiet recognition that most people never really talk about. The kind of moment where you are not sure if something changed outside or inside you first, because there are mornings like this. Maybe you have felt them before, when the world is already awake, but you feel slightly out of sync with it. When even ordinary things like a bird on a branch seem to carry more attention than they should, and you tell yourself it is nothing, just your mind filling silence with meaning, but still you notice it, and that is the part you never quite forget, because deep down you know you have experienced this before. Maybe while walking to your car and suddenly feeling like someone paused just long enough to look at you, or standing near a window without any clear reason and feeling a presence that you cannot prove but also cannot fully dismiss. And this is where the mind quietly starts to mirror itself, trying to explain what the body already sensed. And the cardinal remains there in the distance as if it is part of that same quiet logic, not reacting, not escaping, just existing in a way that makes the space between you feel slightly more defined. And if you are watching this closely, if you are noticing how small these details feel and yet how strongly they stay with you, take a moment to stay with this channel. Because what unfolds next is not about finding answers quickly, but about seeing how often these small patterns repeat without us realizing, and how something so simple can begin to feel like it carries more weight than it should. And that is where the story begins to deepen, not in what is happening, but in what you are starting to notice has always been there. As the morning light continues to rise, something subtle begins to shift in how the scene feels, not because anything dramatic has happened, but because you start noticing details you did not register before, like the way the cardinal adjusts its position on the branch in small increments, not randomly, but with a kind of quiet timing that feels almost rehearsed by repetition, as if it is responding to something you cannot quite see. And this is where a different layer of understanding begins to open, not in a sudden revelation, but in the slow realization that what looks like simple stillness might actually be a form of reading. It's a way of interpreting the environment that does not rely on words or thought as you understand them. And if you pay close attention, you might notice that it is not only this moment that feels structured in this way, but many small encounters you have had before. Brief pauses in nature where something seemed to register your presence before you even acted. And researchers observing urban bird behavior have noted patterns like this as well, describing how certain species begin to anticipate repeated human movement in shared environments, not through intention, but through recognition of consistency, timing, and spatial rhythm. And suddenly, the idea that this cardinal is simply present begins to feel incomplete, because presence alone does not explain the way it seems to align itself with your stillness. And yet there is nothing supernatural being claimed here, only the quiet possibility that awareness in nature may operate on layers we rarely stop long enough to notice. And as you stand there, the boundary between observer and observed begins to feel slightly less fixed, as if both sides of the moment are participating in something neither of them fully understands. And it is in that subtle uncertainty that the feeling deepens, not as fear, but as the quiet sense that you may be part of a pattern that has been unfolding longer than you have been aware of it. Standing there in the softening morning light, you begin to notice how the moment itself feels strangely structured, as if there is an invisible logic holding everything in place. And this is where a quieter kind of explanation begins to surface, not as a disruption of the feeling, but as a soft frame around it. Because in behavioral ecology, researchers have observed that many common backyard birds do not operate on random movement alone, but on learned spatial and temporal patterns, meaning they begin to associate specific locations with predictable human presence, not in a cognitive, emotional way like humans do, but through repeated exposure to timing, distance, and movement consistency. And that simple idea begins to shift the way this moment feels, because the cardinal is not just being there, it is responding to a map that has been quietly forming over time, a map built from repetition you never intentionally thought about. And studies from urban ornithology, including long-term observations of species like cardinals and chickadees, have documented that these birds can adjust their approach behavior based on repeated, non-threatening human activity, reducing their alert distance when a pattern is deemed stable. And this is not imagination or symbolism, but a measurable adaptation to environment. Yet what makes it feel unsettlingly intimate is not the science itself, but the emotional translation of it, because what you experience as being noticed may simply be the overlap between your unnoticed habits and their highly sensitive pattern recognition. And suddenly, the stillness of the branch, the angle of the bird's head, the timing of its pause, all begin to feel less like random nature and more like a quiet system of recognition unfolding in real time. Not because it understands you, but because it has learned you in fragments of behavior that you never thought were being recorded at all. As you remain still in the quiet air of the yard, something subtle begins to change in how you relate to the moment itself. Not because anything external has shifted, but because your attention starts to settle in a more intimate way, as if you are no longer just watching the cardinal from a distance, but sharing a small fragment of space with it. And the longer you stay in that silence, the more details begin to matter. Like the way the bird occasionally shifts its weight from one foot to another on the branch, a barely visible motion that feels strangely deliberate when everything else is still, or the way its head tilts slightly, not in panic or alertness, but in a rhythm that feels closer to observation than instinct. And this is where the connection begins to feel less abstract and more physical, because you start noticing your own presence differently too, the subtle movement of your breathing, the faint sound of fabric shifting as you adjust your stance, the way even the smallest motion seems to register more clearly in the absence of noise, and it becomes difficult to separate what is observing from what is being observed, as if the space between you and the bird is no longer empty but quietly shared. And in moments like this, researchers studying animal habituation often describe a gradual reduction in perceived threat between species that repeatedly occupy the same environment, leading to what they call a stabilized tolerance zone, where behavior becomes less reactive and more patterned over time. But what that sounds like in theory is very different from what it feels like in experience, because here, in this small, ordinary yard, it does not feel like a scientific adjustment. It feels like a quiet familiarity forming without permission. And as the cardinal remains in place just long enough for you to notice that it is still there, you begin to feel something shift that is not quite understanding, but not quite imagination either. Something closer to presence, shared and unspoken. And it is in that soft overlap that the moment begins to hold you in a way that makes it harder to look away. As the silence between you and the cardinal continues to stretch in a way that no longer feels like emptiness, but something more structured, you begin to notice that the moment itself is no longer staying still, because even though the bird has not moved far, the feeling around it keeps shifting in subtle layers, like an invisible pressure building in the air without sound. And you realize that what started as a simple morning observation is slowly becoming something harder to categorize, Not because anything impossible is happening, but because too many small things are happening at once to still feel random, like the way the cardinal suddenly turns its body slightly toward the open yard, then pauses again, as if recalibrating something you cannot see. And at that moment your attention drifts outward, and you notice for the first time how many other small presences exist in the same space. Distant movement in the trees, faint flickers of motion along the fence line, a quiet coordination of life that usually disappears into background until you are forced to slow down enough to see it. And researchers who study avian collective behavior often describe this kind of environment as a shared alert field, where multiple species respond not only to direct threats, but to the behavior of each other in real time, creating a kind of distributed awareness that spreads faster than individual perception. And although that explanation sounds technical, what it feels like here is something far more intimate, as if the yard is no longer just a place you are standing in, but a system you have temporarily entered, one that is quietly registering your presence as part of its ongoing rhythm. And in that realization, there is a subtle shift, not of fear, but of scale, because suddenly the world feels larger in a way that includes you differently than before. And as the cardinal remains at the edge of its branch, holding that same quiet attention that seems neither aggressive nor indifferent, only aware, you cannot help but wonder how much of this moment is being shaped by what you are noticing, and how much of it has been noticing you all along. As you continue standing in the same quiet space, something in the atmosphere begins to feel less like a single moment and more like a threshold you have unknowingly crossed, because the longer you stay with the cardinal in view, the more difficult it becomes to separate what is simply happening from what it might mean in a broader sense, not in a dramatic or absolute way, but in a quiet, reflective one that lingers at the edge of understanding. And this is where many people begin to describe experiences like this in different ways, some calling it instinct, others calling it awareness, and some simply saying there are moments in nature where everything feels briefly aligned in a way that is hard to ignore. As if the boundary between observer and environment becomes softer for a short time. And in behavioral studies, there is even discussion about how repeated exposure between humans and wildlife can create a form of mutual familiarity, not consciousness in the human sense, but a gradual tuning of responses that makes interaction feel less like collision and more like coexistence. And sitting with that idea here in this yard, you might start to feel something subtle shift in your interpretation of the scene, because the cardinal no longer feels like an isolated subject being watched, nor do you feel entirely separate from it. Instead, there is a strange in-between state forming, where attention itself feels shared even without communication, and something about that feeling is difficult to ignore, not because it proves anything beyond explanation, but because it changes how silence is experienced, making it feel less empty and more inhabited. And as the bird remains steady in its place, you begin to wonder whether what you are sensing is meaning being projected onto nature, or nature quietly reflecting something back that you were not prepared to notice so clearly. By now, the yard feels different in a way that is no longer about what you are seeing, but about how quietly you are seeing it. Because the longer you remain in that same position, the more the world seems to slow down into smaller, softer layers of attention, where even the faint movement of air through the leaves carries a kind of presence. And the cardinal is still there, but it no longer feels like the center of anything, more like part of a larger stillness that has gradually closed in around both of you, not as confinement, but as quiet acceptance. And in this moment, there is nothing new happening, nothing demanding explanation, only the simple continuation of being there. And yet that is exactly what makes it feel so heavy in meaning, because when everything else falls away, what remains is often what people remember the longest, and many people who spend time observing nature in this way describe similar moments, not as revelations, but as pauses in perception, where thought becomes less important than presence, where the need to interpret slowly dissolves into simply noticing. And something about that state feels difficult to name but impossible to fully dismiss, as if understanding is no longer coming from analysis, but from stillness itself, and you realize you are no longer waiting for the cardinal to do something else, and it is no longer waiting for you either. There is only the shared quiet between 2 points of awareness occupying the same air, and as the morning continues to warm, nothing changes in any dramatic way, but internally something settles, not as an answer, but as a soft acceptance that not everything needs to be understood to be felt. And in that acceptance, the moment finally stops trying to become anything more than what it already is. By the time you finally shift your weight and take a small step back from the window, the yard does not feel any different in its physical form. The branches are still where they were, the light is still rising in the same slow American morning glow, and the Cardinal is no longer there, having slipped away without sound or announcement, as if it had never needed permission to leave. But something in you does not fully follow it back into absence, because the feeling it left behind is not tied to sight anymore. It is tied to awareness itself, and you find yourself noticing how easily the world continues without needing to confirm what you experienced, how the trees remain indifferent, how the air carries on, how everything behaves as if nothing important has just passed through it. And yet, internally, there is a quiet shift that does not fade quickly, a kind of lingering presence that does not ask to be believed, only remembered. And in moments like this, many people describe a similar sensation, not as certainty, but as reflection, as if nature briefly reveals a version of attention that does not belong solely to humans, and then steps back without explanation, leaving you with the impression that something meaningful occurred even if nothing can be proven. And as you turn away from the window, the ordinary sounds of the day begin to return. Distant traffic, a neighbor closing a door, the subtle hum of a waking world, but none of it fully replaces what just happened. It only surrounds it. And before this moment fully dissolves, it is worth sitting with the idea that not everything we feel needs confirmation to leave a mark on us, because some experiences do not arrive to be understood, only to be noticed, and then allowed to fade on their own terms. And if you have stayed until this point, thank you for being here through this quiet unfolding. It is not something everyone pauses long enough to witness, and if you find yourself drawn to these kinds of stories, you might consider subscribing before you leave, not as an instruction, but as a continuation of curiosity, because there are still countless quiet moments like this happening all around us every day that most people never stop long enough to see. And maybe that is the real mystery, not what the Cardinal saw or what you saw, but the fact that for a brief time, you were both part of the same silence. And as this morning moves on and the world resets itself into routine, you may still find yourself wondering whether anything ever truly disappears, or whether it simply steps just far enough away to stop being noticed. And somewhere out there, even now, in another yard, under another sky, something small and watchful may already be waiting again, and maybe it was only a bird, but it never felt like only a bird.